So there's obviously a comparison to be made between Polkadot and Cosmos, and we'll kind of wind our way through to that. It's not so much going to be the main theme of this talk. Someday such a talk will probably exist. So there is, in general, a lot of commonality between the perspective that Gavin was giving in his talk this morning and what the goals of Cosmos are, which is that building new blockchains, so there's a natural need to build new blockchains. The naturalness of that need to build new blockchains comes from, the need to introduce new cryptographic primitives, new consensus algorithms. In general, the design space of what a blockchain is and what it could be is just beginning to be explored. How much of the blockchain should be proofs? How much of the blockchain should be data? All of this needs to be figured out. And right now, we have been sort of artificially holding back the exploration of that design space because blockchains are hard to build. And what Cosmos has been building is an opinionated framework for building blockchains and an opinionated framework for how those blockchains should connect to each other and how those blockchains should be secured and how we deal with what happens when blockchains fail. Because in a world where there are thousands and thousands of blockchains, blockchains will obviously fail. So our sort of first contribution is the Tendermint consensus engine. So Jae Kwon invented Tendermint in 2014. He was one of the first people to really start working on the consensus problem in a serious way. And what Tendermint contributes to the world of consensus is taking 40 years of BFT consensus research that was done in academia and moving into the practical engineering world of something that can be used to really build an application. So Tendermint has been an existing product. It's been an existing thing since the original open sourcing of the code back in 2014. It matured a lot in 2015, and now, essentially for the first time in history, on the Cosmos testnets, we have hundreds of strangers running a BFT consensus algorithm together. And empirically, this has performed relatively well. And to make the comparison to some of the other innovations in consensus that we see in next generation blockchains, like Ethereum 2.0 or what Polkadot's trying to build with Grandpa, Tendermint is a consensus engine that is focused on one case, which is the sort of asynchronously safe safety over liveness case of blockchains. I'm not going to go too much into detail on exactly how Tendermint works in this talk, because there are plenty of talks that exist that sort of explain this. But existing in this asynchronously safe space is a sort of fast finality, asynchronously safe space, is a really interesting place to operate, and it's what gave rise, and sort of this observation of what could we do with these properties gave rise to how Cosmos was conceived. And what we realized was that if you have Tendermint, and Tendermint gives you fast finality and this really efficient light client protocol, it's really easy for blockchains to send messages to each other about their state. So this was why Tendermint enables us to build Cosmos. And so Tendermint is an open source project. It isn't deeply integrated into the Cosmos stack. It has its own socket protocol that anyone can build an application on top of. And Cosmos and the Cosmos SDK are just one of those applications. So the next sort of frontier that Tendermint has sort of been focused on building to sort of enable Cosmos is Jay always imagined that once you had Tendermint and you had this really robust consensus engine, that you could actually implement proof of stake on top of it. While that was a great idea, we've spent maybe the last 8 months implementing it and really implementing it over in this time period and working out attacks and figuring out all the things that could go wrong. And implementing proof of stake actually turns out to be extremely challenging. But given that proof of stake is done, we consider it like one of the major value propositions of Cosmos. Not only can people who are building Cosmos chains take advantage of Tendermint as a consensus engine, they can take advantage of their own independent proof of stake system to give them sort of their own economic sovereignty. So one of the things that we're hoping to kick off probably right after DevCon is this thing called Game of Stakes. So another sort of guiding factor of Cosmos is that we're big believers in empiricism. And so we've been running Cosmos testnets with Tendermint, with strangers on the internet for months at this point, and they continue to perform very well. We don't see any liveness problems with them, which is sort of the problem that many of these alternatives to Tendermint are trying to solve. We haven't actually experienced them in the real world. But nobody has run one of these BFT proof of stake systems before. Systems like Tezos or Quantum are sort of these liveness favoring, non-BFT, synchrony-based systems, and nobody's really run them. So what we want to kick off is this, what we're doing for the first time is we're putting a monetary prize in Atoms, our sort of staking token for the Cosmos mainnet, to people who can figure out ways of exploiting our incentive layer. So we're about to start this sort of large-scale experiment. We've sort of entries ended on Monday, where we're going to have hundreds of players trying to figure out whether or not they can form cartels and actually execute some of these theoretical attacks on BFT proof-of-stake systems. And probably by the end of November, we'll have a better idea of what these attacks look like in the real world. Now, I'm not expecting any of these attacks to affect our ability to launch a mainnet. It would be extremely shocking to me. But what it will do is give us, for the first time, the ability to sort of observe attacks on proof of stake in the wild and figure out whether or not, and build observability tools to sort of understand how those attacks. And it certainly will influence future generations of the Tendermint consensus algorithm. So the next sort of piece of the Cosmos stack is the Cosmos Sdk. So the Cosmos Sdk is a modular framework. In many ways, it sort of sits in the same place in the sort of developer toolkit as Substrate. And it's written in Go. It has a sort of opinionated framework of bits and pieces and modules and how they compose. Our kind of vision is a Ruby on Rails for building blockchain. It's open source, available on GitHub. It has sort of an interesting security module about how modules interact with each other. So this initial set of modules, governance, accounts, staking, slashing, rewards, and fees, and IBC, are sort of the core of what makes it possible and easy for a developer to launch a new blockchain within the Cosmos network of blockchains. And all of these modules are at this point fairly mature. IBC is probably the last thing that we're going to build, probably shortly after the mainnet launches. The sort of value prop here is that a number of these primitives are incredibly challenging to get right, especially the reward and fees and the staking and slashing system. It's a very daunting task, and it certainly consumed an enormous amount of our engineering resources to specify and optimize these pieces. But for instance, our staking and slashing system is not merely limited to applications in consensus. It's also possible to sort of build arbitrary crypto-economic protocols on top of them. And our fee distribution system is also incredibly powerful. It's able to, in protocol, distribute fees to thousands of economic participants in a blockchain efficiently. So this gives you a lot of options for how you actually build the crypto-economic layers and the incentive layers of your system. So our sort of core vision of what the SDK is offering to developers is you want to build a new blockchain, or more specifically, you have a distributed, decentralized application, you have a Web3 application that you want to operate at scale, at consumer scale with high throughput, and sort of its own economic model. The Cosmos SDK sort of gives you a system for doing that out of the box. And that's sort of, in my mind, kind of the unique piece of it. unlike sort of other frameworks which are for sort of blockchains, which have less of the economic layer sort of thought out at this point. But so Cosmos is a network of blockchains. And so the key piece of sort of what makes this network work is this inter-blockchain communication layer. And inter-blockchain communication is, so the simple idea is that you can have many blockchains running Tendermint consensus, able to send light client proofs of data in that blockchain to each other. And our goal initially is to move coins between blockchains and then expand to more complex kinds of objects over time. This enables a sort of horizontally scalable ecosystem where each distributed application is its own blockchain, but they're able to share sort of this common framework of assets. And the question of composability has come up a lot. And IBC is sort of a vision of how composability is possible in a sort of network of blockchains. So most blockchains, most distributed application ecosystems in sort of the open finance worldview interact with each other using basically a token interface. And sort of the simplest object that IBC will support is a token. So you can imagine things like stable coins and other applications of sort of building their own zones and then exposing APIs to consume tokens generated by those zones across the Cosmos ecosystem. So we've been spending 2 years building these bits and pieces, and then the question is like, sort of what's next? The first thing that's next is obviously launching the mainnet, which we're trying to do sort of within the next couple of months. Our lack of specificity about the date is mostly a result of kind of winding down features and being in sort of like the battle of shipping the last bits and pieces of this. Cosmos is fundamentally a 2-year-old design. We sort of came up with this design in the summer of 2016, and we've learned a lot about how developers actually build applications that wasn't really clear when we started designing Cosmos. I'm really surprised at the extent to which the Cosmos design seems relevant in the sort of current version of sort of application ecosystem, but obviously there's going to be room for future progress. So as I mentioned, there's the token-based IBC model is sufficient for many use cases. Retailing digital assets, whether it's sort of the gaming model of we have a bunch, you want to build a system where people are going to use and consume and own digital property, decentralized exchanges, stable coins seem to be like a natural sort of thing that you add to the Cosmos ecosystem. You can imagine zones being able to hold collateral in other assets, et cetera. But the core idea of IBC comes down to how we think about zone failure. And this is what I think differentiates like all of these scalable blockchain systems from each other. Cosmos acknowledges the idea that a given chain can actually fail. So what does failure look like? Failure looks like the DAO hard fork, where the validator set on a network decides to take a bunch of money from one user and give it to another user. And this can be done because of a political consensus that was reached to revert unexpected behavior on the chain. It could also look like a malicious validator set stealing all of someone's money. And the core thing that we wanted to do in Cosmos is deal with the problem of failure without sort of additional complicated systems, whether it's sort of random validator election or fisherman. So the question that we've been focused on for sort of the future development of sort of Cosmos and the IBC protocol is how do we think about, how can we extend this while retaining that property? How can we sort of engage with the compositionality of different blockchains in the Cosmos network without sacrificing this fundamental security property. So over the next couple of years, what I'm expecting from the Cosmos ecosystem is that we're going to extend IBC to support lots of different ways in which applications can compose with each other without changing this sort of fundamental design paradigm. That developers are free to build any blockchain that they want and integrate it with the Cosmos network. And once they've built that blockchain, they can interoperate with a set of assets in this sort of loosely joined ecosystem that doesn't need either like a global shared governance system, a global security token, or any other sort of global property enforced across all of the different blockchains in the network. So that's been sort of the core vision of Cosmos. And so I figured that there would probably be a lot of questions about how Cosmos and Polkadot are different from each other. So I thought I would keep like the last 10 minutes for people to ask. What are your questions, concerns, feelings about, sort of where Cosmos sits in this ecosystem? Does anybody have any questions? Yeah, absolutely. So the question was, compare and contrast the Cosmos SDK from a developer experience point of view. So this is sort of the hardest, or the Cosmos SDK and Substrate are fairly fast-moving targets. A couple of weeks ago at SF Blockchain, or like a week ago at SF Blockchain Week, Sunny from the Cosmos team gave a demo that was sort of in the same spirit of what Gavin just did this morning. How do you construct a simple application from nothing to having your own blockchain running? I believe that there's video of that demo. There's definitely on Sunny's GitHub. There's a sort of implementation of it, and the Cosmos team is sort of working on turning that into like a more standard set of documentations. The other thing that I would say is that doing simple stuff is probably the wrong model for understanding the developer ergonomic experience. There's about a dozen sort of late-stage applications that are going to launch testnets on top of the Cosmos SDK within the next sort of quarter. And what we've observed is all of those users are building really complicated things. They have complicated crypto economics, they have complicated slashing rules, they have complex transaction needs. And one of the advantages that I would say of the Cosmos SDK is our staking, slashing, governance, fee distribution system is probably the most complicated system running on a sort of protocol running on top of a blockchain that exists today. And so the Cosmos SDK, we've had to build APIs and abstractions to support that immense complexity, and Substrate is in that sense less mature. Does that make sense?
Can you reach it?
Require an exit game and a challenge period for security.
Yep.
That's something that the Cosmos ecosystem will also need.
So this comes down to like a sort of fundamental question. So the way I think of the Plasma ecosystem is the Plasma ecosystem has a requirement that not only there be exit games, but those exit games be succinct. I.e. the proofs that the user must provide in order to engage in the exit game are small. The Cosmos was sort of and this creates like an interesting set of trade-offs. As a developer, you can only build a small set of possible state machines for which succinct exit games are possible. And what we found sort of looking at our user community is there is not a solid mapping between exit games that are possible, or state machines where exit games are possible, and what blockchain developers actually want to build. As a result, the sort of vision of Cosmos at this point is any system that like adds exit games to the Cosmos ecosystem would be additive and further constrain developers. There's certainly teams working on Plasma implementations based on Tendermint and the Cosmos SDK that we could potentially work into the Cosmos ecosystem. But I think the biggest sort of unresolved question with Plasma is whether or not this constraint of succinct exit games is something that will generalize to what developers actually like want and need from their custom blockchains. Other questions? I don't see anyone's hands up, but oh, there we go.
First of all, I would just like to congratulate. I think Cosmos is one of the most transparent projects out there.
We could do better.
No, seriously, the Medium channels, every time you guys do any update or anything, it's always very user-friendly.
Give me a question. Stop blowing smoke up my ass.
So the question specifically, I like the fact that you guys are asking for like malicious attacks. Come on, get cartels.
Yeah.
Are you planning any kind of live stream to show to the public how to, for like a beginner person that doesn't have Golang installed in the computer, could you possibly teach from the basic to how to download the SDKs and then try to join this community?
Yeah, it's sort of an interesting question, and I don't mean to put you down, but like, who is the target developer of a Cosmos SDK application? And my suspicion is that what we're building both Cosmos and the Cosmos SDK and Substrate for is not the people in this room, and not junior developers. What we're actually trying to do is argue to experienced senior developers that for the first time you can actually build something that is broadly useful on top of a blockchain. And sort of my view on like the kind of target developer audience for the Cosmos SDK is not beginners, at least not now. The people who have been having the most success on top of the Cosmos SDK are the kinds of people who picked up web frameworks like Ruby on Rails right when they came out, people who wrote the first iOS applications, people who are kind of used to jumping into a kind of raw, undeveloped, sort of poorly documented framework, figuring out how things work, and like building something useful on it. And I think from those success stories, we're going to learn a lot about like what the developer experience should be. I wouldn't sell anything in the blockchain universe as being particularly mature, and the Cosmos SDK is certainly in the early days. But if you're a fairly advanced developer, I think if you pick it up, you'll figure out how it works pretty easily.
Great, thanks.
Just yell at me, I'll repeat the question.
Please wait.
Thanks. So in terms of the economic incentives behind both Cosmos and Polkadot, what would you describe as some of the main similarities and then differences between the DOT token and then the Atom?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So one of the things that we wanted to avoid in the construction of the Atom is the notion of this like universal security token. While the Atom is responsible for maintaining sort of soundness of the network, you can think of the Atom token as more like a distributed service provider, and that service provider secures a specific set of zones that might do things like peg into the Ethereum ecosystem and manage ETH and ERC20 tokens on Cosmos, peg into the Bitcoin ecosystem, potentially provide certain smart contract zones that with smart contract applications. But anyone who wants to connect, who wants to build a zone and connect to the Cosmos ecosystem doesn't need to own atoms, really doesn't need the idea of connecting to the Cosmos hub or any other hub in our ecosystem is permissionless. And there are sort of very few assumptions that are made by the hub about anything that's like, so there's sort of like an explicit trust minimization between a zone and the hub, and between hubs that are, there's a little bit more trust between hubs that are connected to each other, but there's a very low level of trust between hubs and zones. As a result, it's sort of like we are hoping that our zones will sort of be creative and come up with their own crypto economics to justify that they exist. One of the things that I think is really different about Cosmos is we anticipate there's going to be ample room for like incubation and for zones to figure this out, but in sort of the fullness of time, we expect, like, if a Cosmos zone cannot come up with an economic justification for its existence as a distributed blockchain, it won't exist. Probably have time for like one more question.
Can you speak at all about any of the initial zones that are being developed, or if not, about any particular interesting patterns that have come about as that process is?
Yeah, I probably should have had a slide on that. The initial set of zones. So we talked about a few of them. There's Lino, which is like a distributed sort of YouTube streaming application. Well, okay, so themes. Themes are easier. What we mostly see are people wanting consumer scale in the near term. Tendermint, current benchmarks that I've seen from third parties are something around the neighborhood of 750 transactions per second. Tendermint, on the other hand, has not been optimized for throughput in any way, shape, or form, neither has the SDK, and we're still seeing like hundreds of transactions per second in throughput, which gives people a sense that they can get to, you know, tens of thousands of daily active users in a fairly short order. And that's been probably the most compelling reason why developers have chosen to invest in the SDK, is a really simple story towards having in early 2019 a consumer scale distributed application.
Can I ask one more?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Do you imagine a kind of marketplace for zones, both advertising to users and to validators or stakers?
Yeah, and there's probably about 4 projects that are building something like that right now. It seems like a very compelling, like an emerging competitive piece of our ecosystem.
Or if you could speak briefly about what would be the process of launching a zone, whether presently you need to sort of build up a community and advertising around that, or whether there will be, I am willing to bootstrap this zone by incentivizing on my own validators.
Yeah, I've got about 40 seconds, and this is probably like the hardest question. So here's what we think, is that existing validators or in a community will see an economic incentive to helping zones bootstrap, because ultimately it influences the value of their atoms. So there will be a community of validators that will probably be willing to validate zones with unclear economic incentives. And that sort of becomes the bootstrapping process, and I think we're seeing like a services layer on top of that sort of starting to emerge. Once you have that, then you can have, then blockchains will sort of pop into existence, market themselves to users as secure systems, and connect to the Cosmos Hub, get liquidity through that, and an ecosystem will emerge. So thank you very much.